Welcome. I am Dr. Nicholas Conrad Langlie, but unless you're going to hire me for a job, I want you to call me Nick. I am here to talk to you about instructional technology, particularly where technology and instruction are right now. I spent the summer going to a number of conferences in and around Virginia, learning about best practices from some of the smartest people in the field. And I'll share with you that last semester I spoke to a group of students and had to change my presentation completely because the research is showing that there is a lot of cool new things out there, new practices that will really benefit you, and I think you're going to really enjoy what we're going to talk about. The first is that I need to set up some context and tell you about inverted classroom pedagogy. Some of you may be familiar with it, but they call it the flipped classroom. No, it's not a bunch of people sitting upside down in the classroom with their butts glued to the ceiling. It is actually where you take the idea of standing in front of people and just talking through a PowerPoint for 3 hours and you turn it on its head. There is a great deal of learning materials and activities and resources freely available online that are of high quality, and the mechanisms for you to record your own content and document things are easier than they've ever been. So the thinking is, why don't you take the knowledge, have the students absorb it outside of the classroom as much as possible, and spend your time in the classroom on the application pieces, the refinement pieces. By doing so, you increase the likelihood that your students are going to retain that information. So as much of the teaching that you could push on to the students, the better off you're going to be. It sounds a little weird. Hey, slide, slow down. Okay, hold on. All right, so that's inverted classroom pedagogy. Why is it important? Because you all know this. When I was an undergraduate, every one of my lectures was pretty much either guided by transparencies or PowerPoints. There's 59% of college students reported that at least half of their lectures were boring. You know why they were boring? Because the teacher didn't know how to use PowerPoint. And neither do I, apparently. So the idea is that you just don't teach by telling. And everybody loves a DVR. Let me tell you, the fact that you can go back and revisit something over and over again that you had a problem with is phenomenal. When I was in college, I had these complicated biology classes in particular that I was not very good at. And sure enough, I would have to go back to the teacher or consult my other students. Now our professors record the lectures using lecture capture technology, and it's super easy to use. Let's see, maybe this will fix it. Bear with me for a second. All right, so using technology that students can integrate with and use to collaborate in highly visible ways. So here's where things have changed in the last year. A lot of research has been done on the use of technology in the classroom, particularly the use of cell phones and social media, and we've discovered that there are certain avenues where it just doesn't work well. And through that research, they found that the more students are encouraged to collaborate in a highly visible way from them in the classroom out to the world, the more likely it is that they're going to learn and be able to use those technologies to good effect. So I was just talking to a professor on the hallway about Twitter. I don't like Twitter in and of itself. If there's a real reason for using it, fantastic. But the teacher was like, I don't even understand the concept. Why would I want to use it? In those cases, I would say don't. But a lot of the social technologies, if you put it out there, and I'll explain a little bit more about this in a few minutes, if you put it out there with the students and have them collaborate with one another and make them responsible for the learning, they will use it to great effect, and it will really actually help them in their pursuits. And we're going to address that several times today. Now, as the teacher, you really, when thinking about technology, you have to ask yourself 4 key questions. The first is, how do I think? I mean, how do I think when I use a computer? Like when I don't know something, what do you do? You really should think about that and think about how your students do it and determine if they're doing it right or wrong. And there is a wrong way to search for things. How do I question and search? And I'm going to give you some examples on how you can learn how to search more effectively and teach your students to do it. because one of the problems with free access to all information is that people don't know how to think critically to find the right resources because everything's there. So they get overwhelmed. And I'm going to give you some tips on how to avoid that and to make yourselves better working professionals. How do I contribute? And this is true in your community of learning, like with other teachers. And the idea is that the more you participate and interact with your peers, the more likely it is someone's going to give you a job, for one. But two, you're going to get free resources. Three, you're going to have other people to commiserate with because Johnny Badseed is driving you crazy, and Susie Happy has a good strategy for how to deal with that person. So there's a lot of areas where you really want to think about how can I contribute to the greater world using the internet, and then promote that with your students. And then finally, and this is particularly true with your classrooms, how do I get the family involved? How do you get your kids to get their families involved in what they're learning and doing in and out of the classroom? And I'm going to give you a couple tips on how to handle that, which I think will be highly effective. And research is showing, particularly with students who have parents who aren't native to the US, that this is a really highly effective strategy. So these 4 questions should start to guide where you're thinking. And then when in doubt, keep calm and ask Lord Google. Oh dear Lord Google, I love you. Now Google's fantastic. For you as the teachers in particular, if you have trouble and you can't figure out how to do something, ask Google. We have a cadre of instructional technology collaborators at Longwood, one of whom is present, who provide help to the faculty here on technology things, and often it's a matter of just them typing into Google the question. And then the teacher gets the answer and they're like, oh, you're brilliant. And then the ITC says, well, yes, I am, thank you. So if you're ever worried, go to Google. That said, with your students and with yourselves to a certain extent, you need to know how to use those tools in a way to get good information. And I'm going to show you some examples right now that I think and hope you're going to like. So critical thinking and search. This starts at the first week of school, and it doesn't matter what grade level you're in. You need to teach your students to navigate the internet thinking critically. So you should give them assignments and examples that empower and enable them to have experiences where they can find good and not so good information. So let me show you a couple examples that are really used. So you can find some bogus content on the internet. This is the Pacific Northwest octopus. It lives in a tree. People believe that this exists. Have your students look it up and have them explore why or why not the Pacific Northwest octopus is or isn't a real thing. There are some actual photographs of real octopuses or octopi, I don't know how you call it, in trees that people planted and then made fake websites about. And kids believe it. There are papers being written about this octopus and sightings. How? I mean, that's obviously someone's stuffed animal. It's not a bad stuffed animal, but still. All right, next example. Here's a good one that's a legitimate example that'll teach you a Google operator. Let's say you want to study the American Revolution. If you put studying the American Revolution into Google, you're going to get only a US perspective and a lot of news type sites. But it doesn't give you the perspective of a global society. If you use site:, which is, it says siteschool.uk, you can have it studying the American Revolution. You could do a search just through schools in Britain, and then you can have your students say, you can say to them, hey, I want you to research the American Revolution on regular Google, and then explore the American Revolution on British Google, and then compare those two sources and point out the similarities and differences and why you think that is. So that is a way to force them to think critically, and you can do that with any of your assignments. And actually that site tool is really powerful, and I'll explain some more, but I want to give you a couple examples further just so that you can see what we're talking about. Here's a really good example that blows people's minds when they first hear about this. MartinLutherKing.org. is a website that purports to say nice things about Martin Luther King Jr., significant historical figure, as you all know. But if you put the word link colon in front of that website, link colon will allows you to see what websites link to a particular website. And it's linked to by a bunch of white supremacist websites. And if you dig further down, you can learn that this website's run by a place called Stormfront, which is a white supremacist group. And they created a somewhat legitimate looking website to communicate misinformation about a historical figure. Your students would happen upon this and they may not know how to handle that. So if you share that with them and say, hey, how do you know that this is legitimate or not? You can teach them how to use these Google operators, but also teach them what is misinformation and what is not. This is a fantastic example. You can email me later and I can send you my slides if you want them. Here's a favorite one. There was a research study on the feline reactions to bearded men. In particular, old pictures of bearded men. Someone created a website with their legitimate research on this. And more than one student thought this was real. So you need to teach your students what is and is not a legitimate source online. And I'll explain further in a minute how you can stick to education sites. But I saw this picture and I just ate it right up. I mean, how could you not love that? All right, so why learn about Google's search operators? You gain precision and power to narrow your search with much better quality in the results. That is huge. It's important for you because I know many of you didn't learn how to do this correctly either. So now you have the opportunity to teach it to yourselves and to your students and get your students involved and be like, hey, can you find some cool search tips to narrow our research down? And if you continue ahead in academia, like if you want to get a PhD or another master's or other degrees, whatever it might be, you're going to have to do research. So these are good tips for you to know. One is cache, www.longwood.edu. If you put the word cache in front of a website, it'll allow you to see a website even if it's gone. It'll show you an old version of a website. So if you want to see a really ugly version of a popular website, you can put cache and it'll show you the history that Google's kept. If you do file type and a file type, it'll allow you to just search for specific types of documents. So if you're doing a lesson on the quadratic equation, you could do quadratic equation file type PPT and see what other teachers out there have already created that you could then possibly adapt. So you have a lot of options. You could do that with documents and PDFs. Site and a country code will allow you to search within any country as if you were there, and it's going to give you wildly different results. And each country has a 2-character code that you can easily just look up, and it's really interesting. Site::edu will allow you to do research and your students just on educational sites. So it allows you to limit for your students and for yourselves some of the misinformation, and that would be a strategy for trying to get around what people present that's actually not true. All right, so your students, to get them involved in technology, it can't just be one-to-one. It can't just be you and them. It has to be them to the world. So you want them to use it so that they're contributing in their classroom in a broader way. And one idea that you can use is you can make all classroom activities social by having your students report out online in a very public way. So you could have every day have a student who's a scribe who live types what goes on in the classroom. So you can have a student take a note, take the notes in your class every day, and then as the semester goes, you're going to see that build, and you're going to see where you're doing well and where you aren't based on what they report and what they do not. So it gives you a way of gauging your own effectiveness and theirs. You could have a team-based approach, which is really interesting, and there's a lot of research that says this is highly successful in most areas where people try this, where you have changing roles, of course, but you'd have a class scribe, an official photographer of the week documenting the learning, a tutorial designer, where you actually have students help design lessons that they teach each other in the class, a video team recording on an iPad or another device, and an official tweeting team that uses the teacher account. so that you can get all your students together. And the more you have them do it online, then the more visible it is, the more likely it is there's going to be peer pressure, healthy peer pressure, for them to keep contributing. Because no one's going to have as big of an influence on them in terms of posting as they are. You think you might, but trying to impress Jane down the hall is probably going to be more important in the moment than worrying about what you saw them type. So with roles changing frequently, you can have the students share their responsibility for what goes on in the classroom, and it allows you to change your role. And it allows you to empower them, and it can be empowering for you at the same time. All right, so reinforce the social with cell phones in the family. A lot of people are going to tell you not to use cell phones. I'm going to tell you not to listen to them. I'm going to tell you that they're going to work out really well for you if you can get your schools to let you use it on a limited scale. And I'm going to give you two ideas that I hope are interesting. One is that on your first parent-teacher night, have all your parents come in and help them set up their phones to receive messages from you. And what you can do throughout the day is post interesting things going on in the class, take pictures, send them to the parents, and it gives the parents something to ask about when the kids get home. It allows them to get more involved in the students' learning, and it encourages that family to participate. And sometimes, when the parents are really not involved, this is really helpful to kind of pull them in a little bit. So this is a picture of an earthworm question that the students have to answer. Students go home, first thing the parents are going to say, hey, how did you do on the earthworm assignment? Otherwise, they wouldn't know about it. It's really interesting. You can have your students take pictures and learn from whatever they capture. But you need to think outside the box with what you're okay with them capturing. So my example here is have them take a picture of a shower curtain and measure the angles. You see all the curves? That's all measurable. That's all stuff that can be learned from using their personal devices. Obviously, they can do things that are inappropriate. I think the last session talked a little bit about that. You have to be diligent about those types of things too, but don't allow yourself to not be creative. Because the technology, if you make it social, you get the family involved, you get the students involved, it works out really well, and a lot of present research is really supporting that. Okay, the secret to social: leverage the peers to great success. Children are social beings and are influenced by their peers. Students will ask friends for help before they're going to ask you. So what do? You note this. This is the most important takeaway. In our new world, every student becomes the teacher. You need to do as much of the knowledge content delivery outside of the classroom as you possibly can, while reinforcing, applying, and ensuring that the students are really getting it in the classroom in a really social way. If you can do that, you're going to be the greatest teacher in the world. Every student has to create. Give them an opportunity to express themselves with the subject matter they're working on, and they're going to impress the heck out of you. And then every student needs a global audience. And when you allow them to be more public, it puts more pressure on them to do well, because they do not want to let their peer group down, and their peer group will not be let down. That is one of the biggest interesting tips that I've learned in the last year from research, is that the more you use the social arena in a very public way and put the responsibility of that on the students, the more likely it is that they're going to do super well in your classes. And that's brand new. And I changed my presentation completely to accommodate that. All right, final food for thought that I want you to think about. I'm doing a lot of research, especially now, these days, on workforce and career readiness skills. And the reason I got involved in it is because there's this huge disconnect between the skill sets that people leave high school and college with and the skill sets that businesses need people to have to hire them. Matter of fact, I met with a guy at a Richmond chamber event a few months ago who worked for Dominion, and he had 30 jobs that he couldn't fill because people weren't qualified for. And yet, we're still in a really bad way in terms of jobs across the nation. So keep that in mind with your students and encourage them to focus on these 10 areas to enhance their ability to become employable down the road. They call it in Virginia workforce readiness. There's 21 standards. Everyone has to take a test for it in high school in Virginia. I highly encourage you to take a look at what they are and to help your children think about how they can address each of these in a public way. Because in a future where everything's online and everyone's vying for the same things, the more that they can show that they're successful and knowledgeable online at an earlier age, the better off they're going to be. Because if you can create a cool visual electronic portfolio of what you're good at, like let's say you have fantastic communication skills, or you have an example of where you've used critical thinking to resolve an argument, if you put that out there in the public realm, when people look to hire you, they're going to look at that information and go, hey, this person's got it going on. And they've addressed all these important concepts that business research says that you need to know. And this is true for you, by the way. You should have this. And if you don't, come talk to us. We can help you. But the 10 areas are communication, presentation, teamwork, leadership, habits for success, critical thinking, problem solving, time management, professionalism, and networking. If you can focus on these, you're going to do really well. And as teachers who want jobs, get involved with the networking groups, get involved with all the state organizations, go to their conferences, because that's where you're going to get the job. You're not going to get it most of the time by just cold calling. You're going to get it because of the good relationships you make. And they call it in marketing terms permission marketing. So you need to give and contribute in order to be able to get the positions that you want by nurturing relationships. My final story is this. It was almost 15 years ago now, I think. I applied for this job at a community college, and I couldn't get a call back. My wife and I were part of this Alliance of Technology and Women, and the woman who ran the group really liked us and said, hey, I went to college with the department chair. Why don't you just tell him you know me? I was like, okay. So I go in, and the guy is sitting there in his office with his 2 manila envelopes with those thick, you ever see those really thick rubber bands that look dirty and really ugly? I still remember the dirt pattern on them. It was so gross looking. So he had this huge stack. My resume was in it. And he said, Nick, and he dropped it on the desk just to be dramatic because he was a little over dramatic. He dropped it on his desk and he says, you saved me from having to look through this. And my resume was in there. And it was because I networked. About 10 years later, we were at a networking event in Saratoga Springs, New York. And I said, I noticed there was a position open. And I said, well, what are you going to do to fill it? And he's like, I'm overwhelmed because there's more than 3,000 applicants now, and I don't know any of these people. Don't be that person. Be that person who gets the job because you've contributed to your peer group, or you're online sharing resources with others in a high-profile way. So just like with your students, make your learning and the work you do as visible as possible. And if you do that, I promise you, you're going to do very well. Thank you. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, langley@longwood.edu.